I've been talking to Christian about coming with in the program with a kind of country of origin perspective, and to see how the country of origin can build up on country of destination, and what can we talk about that. And we've been deciding to talk a little bit about the local context. And I'll jump into the matter simply because we don't have much time for that. In the past years, I was dealing with return migration, which everybody knows that it's a rather old topic, but it was in the past 5 to 6 years, or 10 years maximum, it was refashioned and actually acquired new meanings. As Russell King said, return migration is the last great unwritten chapter in migration history. And indeed, for quite some time, research was more piecemeal. It was not something integrated and theorized and debated, despite the fact that literature on migration and integration blossom and flourish. And it's a huge literature nowadays where we have to swim and to find some main directions. However, there were some foundational works on return migration in the 80s, for instance, some pieces on return to Mediterranean South and to Turkey, and also some conceptual clarifications were realized, such as initial typologies of return, and also mechanism and motivations of return migration. Renewed debate on return were very much tied to debates on development, and everybody knows that the literature linking migration and development and also remittances, it's huge. And in the past 20 years, we witnessed a steep increase in remittances, making countries of origin very important in scholarly debates on migration and also on development, because for 50 years during the Cold War, development sociology, looking in countries outside the so-called developed West, were very much tied up and interested in understanding and researching the development. And in the past years, migration came as a sort of new star in the room, in the sense that people are looking increasingly at the use of remittances, simply because the amount sent back to home countries overcomes 3 to 4 times the whole ODA, overseas development assistance. And the literature on remittances itself is also booming. It was initially coined by Papadimetriou and Martin, the so-called 3R on development: recruitment, remittances, and return. And return was very much tied up to its role in development in regions and countries of origin. Further on, and in the past actually 10 years, literature looked also on the link between transnationalism and return, the ways in which they sort of intimate relations between both of them. And also, there is another one, I don't know if it is on this slide, there is another one, reconceptualization of return from being a kind of permanent move back home to encompassing all sorts of return projects, even temporary, even seasonal, even visits. So basically in this new perspective, return is a transnationalist from country of origin perspective. So whenever returnees, migrants come back home, and if they stay, let's say, at least 6 months abroad, but when they come back home, they qualify as returnees, even though this is only visiting friends and relatives, and it's VFR, which is also a time of return, actually meaning the physical presence of migrants back home to the country of origin. In the 2 years ago, I was working with 2 colleagues, Margit Fausend and Paolo Boccani, and we put forward the notion of transnational return, actually capturing this intimate interlink between return migration and transnationalism, being in countries of destination and origin, where returnees aim at keeping the transnational ties and mobilities with previous regions where they lived abroad. For instance, returnees to Romania, they might be temporary workers in agriculture, staying 6 months in Romania, working in Germany 3-4 months and coming back. But they may be also people who are academics living in Romanian academia and keeping over the years their connections to the previous, let's say, UK, German, or French universities where they get their degrees. So in this respect, this approach also requires defining return not as a permanent stage, as I said, but as a phase within a broader mobility of individuals. And I think this is essential because in Europe, intra-European mobility is highly enhanced. So if in the case of refugees who are assisted to return back home to conflict regions where they're coming from, East Europeans are able to actually pendle, to commute between the countries of origin and destination. So international mobility within Europe, it's very easy. As well, what is interesting is that from this country of origin perspective, transnational return ties contexts of origin and destination and may have different sort of influences at the local level. Another one topic that was coming up in the literature is the notion of returnees reintegration, which started to be debated in the past, let's say, 4 years by Kushminger and others. It is a little bit similar to debates on integration. And it is central, the debate is central to understanding how returnees develop, readapt basically, or adjust to the context of origin. They also help developing their communities of return. The notion of from reintegration may assume return as a national, may not assume return as a national, as a natural process, something that is easy to conduct and somehow natural to returnees. Initially, in the notion of return was considered unproblematic, but people criticize that and say that return, it's also a difficult process sometimes. Whenever we talk about roots and homes, these are constructions, and actually people are not going home to some familiar, but the home that they return to, it changed, or the home that they return to is not having any longer the friends and relatives and connections that had before. So it's again a process of learning and readapting to the new context. Even in the case of returnees who are in a kind of economic advantageous situations, they may have difficulties in returning. For instance, women returning to Romania encountering gender inequalities, initially being adapted to contexts where gender relations were more equal than in Romania, or people who are highly qualified actually having to readapt to the labor market in Romania and to the labor relations, basically, which are more problematic. There were 3 domains of debates of returnees reintegration: debates on return and development, debates on voluntary and involuntary returns of refugees and deported individuals, and finally debates on typologies of returnees. Each of them more or less typifying integration and return positionality differently. Debates on return and development, perhaps the most developed kind of literature from all this I cited before, asks the crucial question: in what conditions are returnees becoming agents in development and change? And there's a lot of literature on economics in this respect, but it looks basically at return entrepreneurs, either as employers or self-employed, what type of social and financial remittances they send back home, and also the role of highly qualified, and Wang and Saxenians were working on that, and the effects that they may have at the national level. For instance, in India, the IT industry is very much tied up to the role of returnees. It was 10 years ago a book on return as issuing major changes in countries of origin, realized by Eckstein. They were looking at different instances and domains where returnees, they are significant players. And talking about Romania, perhaps the richest Romanians are all returnees. I mean, and in the past years, one guy, let's say the past 6 years, one guy who was in Silicon Valley went on from having its company in a communist block of flats in Bucharest to having a company of about 100 billion euros located worldwide. These are just examples, but it shows that sometimes returnees may issue significant changes. A second domain I was less looking at, because it is not my field of specialization, is debates on voluntary and involuntary return of deported people. In the US context, it's very much tied up to the Mexicans deported back home. And in Europe is very much tied up to the refugee literature and the whole assistance programs that were developed, and how, if they are working or not working. Yes, and the notion of sustainable return, in the sense that is a kind of dilemma between policies aiming to keep returnees back home and not to remigrate, and a kind of analytical understanding of return as much more than just remigration, but also a kind of welfare and safety of people. Finally, the debates on return typologies are following a model or modes of integration concept, and seen from a neoclassical perspective. For instance, return is a failure because neoclassical economics says that migration is a natural process and people want to migrate to live better. But from the new economics of labor migration perspective, return is success, simply because people migrate in order to feed their families back home. So from different perspectives, return again is differently seen. From my own point of view, what I think is successful or failure is not just portraying success or failure vis-a-vis migration and mobility, but also vis-a-vis the home community, i.e. somebody is considered to be successful because attains a certain position within a context or not. And I usually employ it in this manner. Furthermore, debates on modes of integration and on return and development stress the major role of context. The context is the basically political and economical units that shape up return, and contexts are important for how return is a selective process. So return is not just the agency of individuals and the resources that they have, but you also have to put in context structures and agency. So we don't have to look only on returnees and their mobilities practices, but also on context, what can context offer and how context change because of return. And somehow my interest is located in this area. Okay, another one point that I think is very highly important, and I will mention now, there is also return should be understood as a time process. People are moving away, they're becoming older. While returning, they can do something else. They cannot do the same jobs that had before. I mean, we are back to 30 or 40s, you aren't able to work as when we've been 20. And as well, the notion of mobility, that people come and go, requires a certain understanding of temporality in respect to how return is defined. But most importantly, in my case, and this was not unfolded in the research, is that the context change, and sometimes change dramatically. And I have experienced a context, Romania, which changed hugely in the past 30 years. So each decade had quite a different outlook. So if you are going back to Romania in the beginning of the 90s, you can't compare situation existing now with situation existing there in all respects, basically. And then this understanding of return as an evolving process, it's interesting and challenging from my point of view. And in Romania, return had an oscillation evolution. Different research unfolding pretty different figures, and also qualitative data sometimes unfold variation in research. For instance, Martin and Radu had they did a projection of return within the Romanian population. About 7% of Romanian population had a migration experience in the past 10 years. In 2012, the figure was for the year 2008-9. Interestingly, in Spain in 2006 and 8, unfolded that return intentions multiplied from 7 to 70% among Romanian migrants in pre versus after post-crisis context. And also Stănciulescu and Stoiciu found that return rates were higher in regions with high migration and less developed economically. And furthermore, 26% of households had one migrant and only 4.6 had returnees. So somehow return wasn't that developed, but this was conducted in these regions. We did a quantitative research and we had some very nice data showing that 15% of Romanians, so people residing in Romania, have migration experience in the past 10 years, which is huge. If we add on top of the number of migrants, so people who aren't in Romania at the moment, will go somewhere between 35 to 40% of Romanian population having direct experience with migration, either by members of their families or by themselves, because the number of those having relatives, family members abroad, is something around 30%, which shows a very mobile population, basically. Now I'll go a little bit to the more details. So I'm qualitative sociologist or anthropologist, and I'll come with two snapshots. On the one hand, it's a city called Sebeș, which is a sort of star in Romanian investment landscape. So it's a small city of 30,000 who managed to get about 3 billion euros investments by different companies, and also in the past 7 years by Daimler, who opened up a plant there. But there, the post-socialist transformations were really dramatic. It was initially the whole region, because we don't have to look only at the city. It was 20, 30 kilometers away. There were another 2 cities, and the whole region was highly industrialized. In Sebeș, it was wood, textile, and leather factories. In Alba Iulia, there were some other factories, and Cugir was arms industry and also machineries industry. And people basically were commuting between these jobs there. But in the 90s, with the fall of the communism, it was a whole decay of the industry, and the labor migration took on early in the 90s. And the effects on the industrial decay were massive. I mean, people lost their jobs. In Romania, overall, 40% of people lost their jobs. And especially for the Roma, it was the most problematic situation, simply because they were the first to be kicked out. And it was a Roma quarter that was segregated, and it grew in size over the years. And they started living out of scrap iron, working for Romanians, receiving social benefits. So very, very poor and very, very segregated and marginalized and discriminated against. After 2000s, when the picture was so bleak, there started to come a series of large-scale investments, also because Sebeș is at a crossroads of main Romanian European roads, now of 2 main highways. There were 2 large-scale investments in wood processing industry with hundreds of millions each. But there is also a series of medium-scale investment in leather, textile, appliances, food processing. Interestingly enough, and we have to go back a little bit to communists to understand the local context, Romanians locally, they're very much entrepreneurial. Either there were some shepherds who were very rich during communist times, because the explanation is a little bit more complex, or there were small manufacturing companies that were still allowed during communist times, because at that time private enterprise was not possible. These people after the 90s had sufficient resources and became in a few years' time quite successful entrepreneurial individuals. So it's not just a place of high investment, it's also a place of high entrepreneurialism. And the place in time in the past 5 to 6 years turned from an emigration to a place of immigration, with workers arriving up to 100 kilometers away, basically coming to Mercedes. And the Roma from the quarter were largely unemployed. They started to be a little bit more employed, but still quite a lot of them are unemployed. How about mobility in this context? So that was the general framework. The migration was ethnically structured. Initially, there were ethnic Germans who migrated to Germany as Aussiedler. There was also a small migration of Romanians to Germany. There were many Romanians who requested asylum in Germany between 1990 and 1992. But out of the community of, let's say, 4,000 ethnic German Saxons, only 400 live today there, very many coming from mixed families. But the whole, let's say, German community, it's about 400 people. A little bit later, it followed a large migration of Romanians going to Spain using migration networks. It developed between 2002 and 2007-8, and it was accompanied by a very strong way of remittances. And actually, after 2008-10, appeared new migration destinations where Roma started to migrate to different European destinations. It was less structured as the previous 2 migrations. So Germans' migration was structured by Germany because they employed by the Aussiedler program. Romanians' migration was structured by Spanish labor market and the demand of workers and the migration networks, whereas Roma were going to many destinations to Europe. And in terms of transnational return, I'm talking about there is a return of long-term migrants, a few successful entrepreneurs, 2 or 3 Germans and some Romanians, only very few of them. There's a return of medium-term migrants, people coming from Spain. And there's also temporary return of temporary migration, Romanians working in temporary work jobs and precarious Roma. In many of these cases, families remaining home. And in some other cases, this temporariness and temporary migration turn into long-term migration with relocation of families abroad. This also among the Roma families. And how returnees fare, and now I'm talking going back a little bit to the modes of integration perspective. So trying to see how return structured a little bit the local society. So they are the so-called well-off. They are developing entrepreneurs, Germans and Romanian in Sebeș. There is one large company in leather industry employing a few hundred workers, and one medium-sized company in tourism and hospitality. In the meantime, there is another 2-3 individuals there. And there are some more surviving entrepreneurs, so people able to have small businesses or being autonomous workers. There are some entrepreneurs investing in hospitality because the consumption market grew very much locally. Then there are more opportunities for returnees to come. And it's interesting because if you are looking at, let's say, how context influence return, in the 90s, there were almost no opportunities to build up on something back home. After 2004, 5, 6, simply because Romania took off very, very strongly, consumption grew. So there are more and more opportunities locally to open something. And people, for instance, who work in restaurants, in the hospitality industry in Greece, or Italy, they thought about opening something back home, or people who work in construction started to work autonomously locally, and sometimes gaining the same amount of money locally in Sebeș as they had before. And another one small pattern is among returnees arriving after long-term migration, employed in local municipal companies or at large-scale companies such as Daimler. And there are also the temporary returnees who try to link opportunities and investments in Romania and abroad, i.e. they are not employers themselves, but they can work as CEOs of multinational or international corporations who open up plants in Sebeș. And there are 3-4 of these people. In some of these cases, they were tied up to, let's say, the former Germans' migration to Germany. So Transylvanian Saxons having connections, knowing people in Germany, interested to invest in Romania, somehow either by themselves or working with some local people in Romania who are trusted. These people who are trusted actually are becoming managers of such companies. And there are the many. It's a majority of long-term and temporary Romanians from Sebeș return temporary from time to time, or if there's only seasonal work, they stay more in Romania and then stay abroad. It's rather failed temporary migration of the many temporary Roma from Sebeș who are adding on their resources by using their accumulating remittances. So what they do, sometimes they work 2-3 months, sometimes they perform street jobs abroad, and they started to invest in their houses in the quarter. So somehow to improve the living conditions. And there is a failed return of Roma who remain poor and segregated and depend on work from Romanians, because this was a kind of pattern. It's a kind of secondary labor market, as in the Western world. Only the secondary labor market in Romania is not necessarily monetarized. So that Roma work for Romanians and getting something, either food or clothes or things, sometimes some money, but it's a kind of sort of not slavery itself, but not indented work, but sort of dependency on those resources. And this changed with migration because very many Roma are able to migrate, they get resources, and they don't necessarily want to do the same thing. Only some of them, they remain in the same kind of trap, I will put it. So the Roma divided themselves into challengers crossing ethnic lines. Challengers are those who are reacting against discrimination, their poverty and segregation. Those crossing ethnic lines, being able to leave the ghetto and to go to the town, to buy a house in the town. Those exiting, i.e. rather preferring to migrate and return only from time to time. And some of them complying to the marginal status that I was talking before. I will rush up a little bit because I have another one presentation. So the picture generally, it's a little bit more diversified than only returnees or successful or failure. Ethnicity, I think, is important here, both in the case of German coming back and occupying a kind of a prestige position back home, or in the case of the Roma attempting to gain recognition and a kind of equal footing with the others. And there is increasing social diversification. So despite beyond the local diversification between sort of employers and workers, and this added value of migration, so mobility adds to the local diversification. So the society becomes increasingly local society increasingly complex. These are some new factories in town, put it like that. As again, it's a lot of traffic and transportation. And this was a picture from the ghetto. And I'll come back right now with a second snapshot. It was a very fresh research in the last summer. I was looking at volunteering and local politics. I carried out field work in the summer and in the winter in southern Transylvania, former Saxon villagers. And I was carrying out interviews with returnees who are involved in local politics and volunteering. Those involved in local politics were either embedded in the activities of the German Forum, the German Minority Association, and in one case it's a USR, it's a party that was coming up from the civil society, but all of them involved in volunteering, and they are coming from different countries. It's a little bit of context that Romania is lacking actually social activism, and the NGOs are rather in urban centers. And beyond the main political parties, the German Forum acts as a sort of political association with very many activities, social activism and involvement in the local community. Therefore, in the region of Sibiu, they won in the past 20 years the local elections at the county and municipal level. What I found in my research was an involvement in the local, and the participation was important. And the forum is active in some respects due to returnees. I mean, looking who is running these activities at the forum, basically the young people, everybody, almost all of them were either migrating to Germany and return, or had shorter migration to Germany and return, and are able to tie up relations between Romania and Germany. And interestingly, also in the two other small cities, which otherwise Romania is quite dry of volunteering, people volunteering were returnees coming either from US, Italy, Germany, and they start to build up things locally. And it was interesting. A little bit of local, in one context, return volunteering, the local community association that turned into an NGO getting funds from the local, national, and European level. And they once they had also the support of the municipality, so they realized the fact that they need these people, and they had a major event called Bikeathon. It's in the region of Transylvanian Alps, so the region is very nice. And they try to, and they work also with different entrepreneurs, and they organize a community foundation involving a lot of NGOs in the whole in the whole region. And they try to develop and to mobilize everything. And it's also a natural park, private natural park, kind of trying to support wildlife and tourism. And in a second context, it's a village that became very vivid, and they attracted support again from local authorities, and also attracted European funds, and they restored the Gothic church and the tower. And also they want to restore the medieval fortress. And there are two informal associations such as Nachbarschaft, Frauen-Nachbarschaft, sort of very old institutional setting in the former Saxon area where people were neighborhood relations, were trying to help each other. But these survive, and they work with two local associations involved in biodiversity. And it is also they are part in different cultural events such as Haferland Festival, attracting many tourists, because people, they discover the region and they find it's kind of rather between kind of exotic on the one hand, at the same time melancholic, and it's very nice. It's a sort of Toscana of Romania. And there are also an important point in the Via Transilvanica, which is a sort of Romanian Camino. And they are trying to build up on that and doing. And why volunteering? It's interesting that volunteering for some of them was a way to reconnect to local societies. In the case of Germans, a sort of responsibilities and also being involved, doing something nice and doing something useful. In the case of labor migrants, they lost a lot of friends and relatives who migrated themselves, and realizing that they don't have too many, suddenly volunteering becomes a way to get to know other people. Secondly, they were able to get some jobs in these NGOs, not necessarily being very rich, but being able to make ends meet. And basically, it's interesting that also in their families, their husbands or wives had better jobs, so somehow in the household was rather relatively stable. But it was getting a purpose, so people like what they do, right? And interestingly, some migrants said that now I feel much better here than I was in Italy or I was in the States, simply because I have something to do. It's a kind of satisfaction, but it's not professional satisfaction, but it's involvement into the local community, right? Giving the people a purpose. And they had different jobs abroad. I mean, they worked in hospitality industry, they were teachers, they were working in offices, seasonal labor, there were students. So there are all sorts of people who realize that the kind of goal in life is to get a little bit more involvement. The things are actually occurring in some other villages where I was doing. I mean, I was running quite a lot in the summer, and everywhere it was this kind of being involved in the local community, which is very, I mean, for Romania is striking. I mean, Romania, nobody trusts each other, you know. Being involving into local community is something that you're not. I mean, what you're going to do, why are you doing that? I mean, there's no sense in that. But somehow the context changed in the sense that there are a bit more European funds, a bit more understanding at the national level, and NGOs are very good in applying and doing projects. So instead of having a kind of state, let's say, level fund offering for municipalities and so on and so forth, going to projects and programs run by projects made a lot of NGOs being able and viable on the market, and they started to be a bit more active. And this idea of being togetherness also came to the fore, and it was interesting. But their return migration wasn't necessarily something that they could build on. I mean, they were having different experiences, and right now in their NGOs activities are doing something else. But basically participation into local life, and also in the case I analyzed, the coalition with local politicians and municipalities that understand their role, I think it was essential. And they gain recognition locally. I mean, people are not thankful is a little bit too much, but somehow they recognize that they're valued individuals locally, making the things move. I'll put some pictures now. On the left-hand side, it's a fortified church in Hosmangen in German, and with the Făgăraș, Transylvanian Alps in the background. I mean, the region is like that. It's biodiverse. There are lots of animals there. In the right side, it's the church in Saski's Kai, South Dodge. Right now the tower is renovated, so initially it was only the church, but right now, I mean, it costs quite a lot. On the left hand side, it's a kind of classical picture on the Făgăraș region, with the Făgăraș mountains, which are the highest in Romania, and the whole depression, and the hilly area to the north. And on the right hand side, it's another village where I was interviewing one second generation Saxon returning to Romania and developing a sort of communal tourist project, so to say. And these conclusions, looking at these places, they are quite different. Sebeș, highly industrialized, and some other spots in Transylvania. Return affects differently the places of return, right? If in the first case, there were many who remained mobile, in the second case, returnees need anchors. So NGOs were anchors to settle and readapt to the local context. And different categories of returnees can benefit differently from their migration experience knowledge. In the case of entrepreneurs in Sebeș, they clearly benefited and try to build up on their migration experience and remittances. In the case of people working in NGO, not that much, right? So we cannot, let's say, generalize the kind of Bourdieu's understanding of returnees as being able to do more. And when we talk about context, we also have to talk also about anchors and anchoring. And again, finally, return effects point towards different dimensions, economic, social, but also political and social activism. And we don't know very much about politics and social activism, at least, especially at the local level. So if we can go to see and talk to some MPs in the parliament, it doesn't mean that we understand the things if you are not going locally. And then we need a bit more comprehensive understanding of return in a country with such strong return. I mean, just imagine 15% of population having migration background. And then looking from this perspective and also building up on mobility requires a differentiated research agenda. And now coming back to the region, so this is biodiverse, but not just people are mobile. In the past years, these are our mobile neighbors. So a lot of bears are coming. So just a kind of metaphor that, yeah, we talk a little bit. And actually the effects of migration and bears, it's also there. So Dankeschön und dann ich bedanke mich nochmal für die Aufmerksamkeit.